Before we begin with actually completing the square, I'm going to divide this slide up and put a little side note. If you want to do this in your notes, you can. If you just want to pay attention to it, that works too. If we have something like x plus 3 squared, do you remember that that is really x plus 3 times x plus 3?
Yeah.
And if we multiply it out, FOIL it out, however you call it, we get x squared plus 3x plus 3x plus 9. There are two 3x's in the middle, so that ends up becoming x squared plus 6x plus 9. This is called a perfect square trinomial. It's a perfect square trinomial because it comes from x plus 3 squared. That is a perfect square. I want you to see the relationship between the 3 in the perfect square and the numbers in the trinomial. So, how do you get 6 from 3? Times 2. How do you get 9 from 3? Times itself. So 6 is 3 times 2, and 9 is 3 squared. This pattern exists every time you are squaring a binomial. So if I had x plus 4 squared, we could automatically say that this is going to multiply out to x squared. 4 times 2 is 8, so 8x. 4 squared is 16. X squared plus 8x plus 16. This is a shortcut that some people learn when they're multiplying these things out. We're actually going to be using this shortcut backwards. If you have a trinomial and you see that this number is 4 times 2 and this number is 4 squared, then you know that that trinomial is the same as x plus 4 squared. That's the direction that we are going to be going today. All right, the first two examples, you actually could solve these by factoring, but we are going to complete the square just to show you the process with some easier numbers. To complete the square, we've got x squared plus 12x. We want to complete the perfect square trinomial, so we need a third term. And I'm going to put a blank on the other side as well. We have to figure out what this third term is going to be. So take a look at the middle term. Remember that this middle term is something times 2. What times 2 is 12? 6 times 2 is 12. So in this blank would go 6 squared. What is 6 squared? 36. But we can't just go and add 36 on one side of an equation because now the equation isn't balanced. To make it balanced, we must also add 36 on the right. Whatever you add to the left side, you must also add to the right side. Okay, now we're going to use this trick over here backwards. We know that this trinomial is 6 squared, or 6 times 2 in the middle, 6 squared for the third term. So it factors into x plus 6 squared. And on the right side, we have 36. Is that the type of equation that we were solving last week? Why, yes, it is. How would we solve that equation? Square root both sides. X plus 6 equals, no, don't move on yet, plus or minus 6. Now remember, this is positive 6 and negative 6 on the right. So we are going to subtract 6 on both sides. Negative 6 plus 6 would be 0. Negative 6 minus 6 would be negative 12. You have to do that problem with both positive 6 and negative 6. Some people might find it helpful to do x plus 6 equals positive 6, x plus 6 equals negative 6, and then, wow, that just skipped to example 5. How in the world did it do that? Apparently. 4, 3, wow. Whew. Okay, how do you feel about example 1? Decent? Let's look at example 2. Now, technically, This one can be solved by factoring. And I'll tell you right now, if you can factor it, factoring is going to be easier than completing the square. However, let's practice completing the square. When there's 3 terms and it says completing the square, I want you to move that third term over to the other side. So we'd add 24 on both sides and have positive 24 on the right. You want to move that third term away so that you can figure out what does this third term need to be to make it a perfect square trinomial. All right, this middle number is 2 times something. What number times 2 gives us negative 2? Negative 1 times 2 gives us negative 2. That number is negative 1, so we need to do negative 1 squared. What's negative 1 times itself? Positive 1. So add 1 to both sides. Okay, I don't like to use the term magic when it comes to math because I don't want math to be magical or mystical. But this negative 1 is kind of the magic number that holds this all together. Negative 1 times 2 is your middle number. Negative 1 squared is your third number. So this factors into x minus 1 squared equals 25. If you're watching the video, pause the video, take a moment to solve that equation out the rest of the way. Okay, so we'd square root both sides. X minus 1 equals positive or negative 5. Finish solving that. Your solutions are 6 and negative 4. There's really 2 parts to this. Part 1 is completing the square and getting it to this equation. Part 2 is solving that equation to get to your 2 solutions. This is the first example that I would say completing the square is really necessary on. You could try to factor this. You could try to find 2 numbers that multiply to give you 10 and add up to 8. Those numbers don't exist. So we have to complete the square. And on this slide, I'm going to write step-by-step instructions so that those of you who thrive on step-by-step have something to look back on. So step number 1 is move the third term to the other side. So we've got x squared plus 8x blank equals negative 10 blank. Step 2 is figure out what completes the square. And I'll give you some guidelines for that as well. Think of the number in the parentheses as b. So b times 2 is your middle term. B squared will be your third term. We need to add b squared to both sides. Then x plus b squared equals, don't move on yet. There we go. So what number times 2? What is our b in this one? 4 times 2 is 8, so our b is 4. So this blank needs to be 4 squared. We need to add 16 to both sides. That number that ties the 8 and the 16 together is 4. So in the parentheses, we put x plus 4. X plus 4 squared equals, on the other side, negative 10 plus 16 is 6. And then our last step is going to be solve using square roots. So square root both sides. Can we simplify the square root of 6? The square root of 6, that's not a perfect square, so it's going to be some crazy decimal. There's not a perfect square we could divide out of it. So we're just going to leave it as plus or minus the square root of 6. Subtract 4 on both sides to get x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 6. At this point, I would like you to pause the video and try example 4 on your own. When you get to a point where you think you're done or you think you're stuck, then play the video and we'll start going through example 4. Pause the video. I don't think you've paused it yet. I think you're just waiting for me to do it for you. You need to pause the video. Your first step, well, really, your first step would be to try to factor this because it will always be easier to factor than it is to do anything else. If factoring doesn't work, move this third term over to the other side and get your blanks in there so you're ready to complete the square. This middle term is 2 times something. It's 2 times -2. So -2 squared is +4. You're going to add +4 to both sides. That completes the perfect square trinomial, which factors into x minus 2 squared. -8 plus 4 is -4. Square root both sides. What is the square root of -4? What's the square root of 4? 2, and because there's a negative in there, it's I. It always thinks that my dotting of the I is moving to the next slide. So our final answer is +2 plus or minus 2I. On your assignment, you have 19 and 20, 23, 24, 29, 30, 33, 34. We are going to cross off number 39 and cross off number 40, 47, 48, and then number 78. Number 78 is like an error problem. Like they did the problem incorrectly. You have to figure out what they did wrong. So make sure that you don't skip number 78 because noticing those errors, that's an important skill to have.